Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our newest segment, of APAICS In Conversation. Today, we'll be featuring the Professor Lorraine K. Bannai, who is the director of the Fred Korematsu Center for Law and Equality and a professor of lawyering skills at Seattle University School of Law. After earning her JD from the University of San Francisco School of Law, Professor Bannai practiced with what is now the San Francisco firm of Minami Tamaki. While in practice, she was on the legal team that successfully challenged the Fred Korematsu's conviction for violating military orders removing Japanese Americans from the West Coast during World War II. Moderating today's conversation is Carol Izumi. She is a law professor at the University of California Hastings College of Law in San Francisco, and she's a professor emerita at the George Washington University Law School. Professor Izumi's work intersects the clinical legal education, race, and conflict resolution. She co-authored Race, Rights, and Reparation, Law and the Japanese American Internment, first and second editions, and has written on prejudice in mediation, restorative justice, and Japanese American redress. In Washington, D.C., she co-founded the Asian Pacific American Bar Association Education Fund and the Community Dispute Resolution Center. And with that, I pass the mic on to Carol.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you, APAICS, and to all of you who have joined us today. It's my pleasure to join this conversation with Professor Lorraine Bannai, a longtime activist and scholar. Our time is short, so let's get started. So I will begin by noting, Lori, you've changed seats. In an APEX conversation in August, you interviewed Don Tamaki, your friend and colleague, former colleague, on the 1984 Korematsu Coram Nobis legal team. As a young lawyer, what were your career aspirations? Who and what influenced you?
So thank you, Carol. I really appreciate that you'll engage with me in this conversation today. And thank you, APEX, and the people who are attending today. There were a couple of things that converged for me that have really kind of guided my path here. Number one, certainly this audience has heard so much about the importance of mentorship and people who have been role models, people who have created opportunities for you. And I've been an incredible beneficiary of that. When I was growing up in Gardena, California, there were amazing Nisei second generation Japanese Americans who were community leaders who really led as far as the importance of public service. And I was certainly inspired by them. I also had parents who never made me think that as a woman, there were things I couldn't do. They might not have said, you can do anything as a woman, but they never made me feel as if I was limited that way. I also remember, one of the first things I remember is hearing Representative Patsy Mink speak when I was in college and really seeing this incredible Japanese American woman, so accomplished, so articulate, but also who kind of just seemed like a favorite aunt as well, this incredible warmth about her. And so she really, I remember that so clearly as an inspiration. I also was really lucky to have professors when I was in law school who were really inspirational and very encouraging, as well as more experienced lawyers and public officials. And so those mentorships and those role models were really meaningful to me. And what was really meaningful was that they were just regular people. You know, they were people who had made choices along the way to pursue public service, people who just said yes when the opportunity came. And so they seemed to me to be in positions that were achievable. And so that was really important to me. One thing, you and I are both in academia, and I feel particularly fortunate that there were some people along the way who gave me opportunities to teach when I never ever thought in a million years I would be a lawyer, number one, but number two, to be a law professor. but people who gave opportunities for me to start teaching, and I really, really loved it. And I would encourage others, people who are watching, to consider jobs in academia. There's not enough diversity in the academy. It's a really important role, and you can really help create the next generation of public policy makers. The second thing that influenced me were the times. I was going to law school in the 70s. It was a period of time when there were special admissions programs, affirmative action programs that had just started. There were more minorities going to law school, more women going to law school, and Baki was being decided. And so I was very influenced by the controversy surrounding that. There was backlash against these programs, saying that unqualified minorities were getting into law school. And so I had the opportunity to, again, be mentored by some people who helped me really see the importance of understanding racial dynamics, understanding the need for lawyers to serve the needs of underrepresented communities. Maybe not full time, but really that being a lawyer is a privilege, and that we have some obligation to help those with limited access to the legal system. So I think that those two things probably have been the greatest influences.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And one of your law professors I know was Professor Charles Lawrence, who really a rock star in the academy. So
I was really very, very lucky to have him as a professor, as well as some other really progressive and forward-thinking, creative thinking law professors at the time.
mm-hmm. Looking at your career, it seems like there's this direct path from the Coram Nobis litigation to your current work at the Korematsu Center for Law and Equality. You're the executive director there, or co-director. To your 2015 biography of Fred Korematsu, and to your most recent scholarly work, which is this book, Race, Rights, and National Security. So what has driven that focus of yours?
Thank you for that question. It does seem like I've spent my entire career kind of really, and I've been fortunate to spend my career talking about the Japanese American incarceration and its current day relevance. It certainly was not how I started into law school, but I've been so incredibly fortunate to be able to have this career. I'm going to go back just a little bit to talk about the Coram Nobis case. I think people are probably familiar with it, but that during World War II, Fred Korematsu, along with Min Yasui and Gordon Hirabayashi, challenged the orders that culminated in Japanese Americans getting put into incarceration camps. And the US Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the mass removal in a really one of the darkest moments in American legal history, as you know. I read about the case in law school. We all read about the case in law school. It was really an unbelievable experience. If you read it in Chuck Lawrence's class and read about how my family's incarceration was upheld by the Supreme Court. When I graduated from law school, I had the great opportunity to join one of the first all Asian American law firms in the country, then Minami Tamaki and Liu, now Minami Tamaki, which did regular bread and butter work during the day, but also did a lot of pro bono work. And one of the pieces of pro bono work was we sued Washington State University to have an Asian American Studies program, a bunch of other things. But one day we were contacted by Peter Irons about representing Fred Korematsu. He had found really incredible evidence saying that the government had suppressed, altered, and destroyed evidence while it was arguing Fred's case before the Supreme Court. And the evidence established basically that there was no military necessity for the incarceration, and the real basis for the incarceration was race prejudice. And so I was 2 years out of law school when this case came into our office. It was an extraordinary opportunity, and we won vacation of Fred's conviction. At the time when the case was over, we thought it was like any other case. You won and it's done, right? But Fred could not have been more prescient. On the day that he won his case, he said to the press, I want to make sure that my lawyers continue to work until we have a time when this will never happen to anyone else again. And so we didn't continue working because he said that, but it was so interesting that he did say that, because as we know, the same type of ignorance and fear that gave rise to the Japanese American incarceration has only continued. I didn't set out to spend my career talking about the Japanese American incarceration or Fred's case, but unfortunately, it has only had greater relevance as the years have gone by. Fred Korematsu's case has been in the news now more than it ever was when it was decided. During the Gulf War, while we were talking about anti-Muslim sentiment, after 9/11, the recent Muslim travel ban, news media, the public, public thought leaders raised the Korematsu case. And so I think those of us who were involved in the case felt like it was really incumbent upon us to continue to be part of the public dialogue about the relevance of the Japanese American incarceration, which then, of course, led us to several of us now, including Dale, Minami, Don Tamaki, several of us from the legal team continue to speak across the country. Now we're speaking on Zoom about the connection between the Japanese American incarceration and today. My book about Fred was written to tell his story to a wider audience. It's more of a, I wrote it to be accessible to a broad audience. And the Korematsu Center today, where I work, is working in Fred's name to carry on his legacy of civil rights work all over the country on a wide range of civil rights issue. Fred was never about just Japanese Americans, really about justice for the wider community. And so it wasn't that I, again, decided that I wanted to spend my career talking about the incarceration, but it really came from Fred's charge and the opportunity to work on his case. And that opportunity to work on his case has really led to trying to respond to the need for people to remember the story, hold the story close, know we did it once, and know we can't do it again. So I've been really fortunate to have this place from which to speak.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. This would be a good time to address this question from the audience. So the question is, what are some of the misconceptions people have about the Fred Korematsu case and JA internment in general?
Oh, it kind of depends on who you talk to, I think. I think that there are certainly people out there who feel as if the incarceration was not wrong, that Japanese Americans were a threat to the country, there have been individuals, public individuals, who have said, you know, we did it before, and so it's okay. Particularly when the Muslim travel ban came up, that basically, you know, the Korematsu case said that we can do what we need to do in the name of national security. And so there's precedent for us doing this. Some people create a false equivalency between Pearl Harbor and Japanese Americans in the mainland. It's kind of like, well, it's okay that we put Japanese Americans in camp because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Carol, you're Japanese American, your parents and grandparents were here, you know, we had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. And I guess the other way that I like to say it is, number one, there was not one documented act of espionage or sabotage from the Japanese American community during the war. But I would also say that even if there was one, that still doesn't justify incarcerating 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of who were American citizens. So I think there's a lot of misconception out there. There are some people who still want to, like Holocaust deniers, want to say that it was right and that Japanese Americans were treated really well. But I think that that's one of the reasons we keep speaking, is so that people know exactly what happened during the war and what we did as a country, and that we will keep doing it unless we remember.
Yes. We have another question from the audience, but I want to hold that question as we talk about your book. And so this might be a good time to segue to the book. So this is the third edition in a series. And I wanted to ask, what were you and the co-author team, what was your goal? What were you trying to accomplish with this third edition? And I note that you changed the name. The title is now Race, Rights, and National Security. So tell us about your goal and what the author team wanted to accomplish.
Okay. First, a shout out to you. You were a co-author of the first and second editions. The first and second editions of this book were called Race, Rights, and Reparations. And the focus of those first and second editions were to use the Japanese American incarceration as a lens through which to understand reparations. So it looked at the Japanese American incarceration, the wartime cases, and then looked at the Japanese American movement for redress as a lens through which to view other reparations movements nationally and internationally. Incredibly timely now, as with this country's now struggling with talking about Black reparations. And so the Japanese American incarceration reparations provides a really important model for that conversation. With the third edition, we found ourselves wanting to use the Japanese American incarceration as a lens through which to view national security. There's many lessons we can draw from the Japanese American incarceration. These are just a couple of them. That basically during World War II, what happened is that Japanese Americans were incarcerated out of fear that they posed a threat to national security. And our concern as authors and many certain public intellectuals and the press and others are deeply concerned about what we're willing to do as a country in the name of national security. That in the name of national security, we're willing to compromise civil rights, we're willing to compromise civil liberties, we're willing to sacrifice rights to keep, quote, keep ourselves safe, right? So during World War II, Japanese Americans were viewed as a threat. Pearl Harbor had been bombed. There was hysteria on the West Coast, and anti-Japanese activists seized the opportunity to say, well, we got to get rid of all the Japanese from the West Coast in order to save us. So the great public furor that was built up, the popular press, the entire West Coast congressional delegation, all the way up to the President of the United States, called for the incarceration and the mass removal of Japanese Americans without hearings, without trial, without charges. And again, 2/3 were American citizens. And we were willing to do this in part because of fear, that in times of perceived fear and perceived national security, there's a willingness to compromise civil liberties. And so that was the lens through which we wanted to use the cases. So the book goes into how, since the beginning of Asian American, Asian presence in this country, they've been targeted because of national security concerns. Very famous case, Che Chan-ping, where the court goes on about how we have to protect our country from the yellow horde that's threatening to come and invade our shores. And that dialogue runs all the way through the immigration cases, even the whole idea of a country being able to protect itself. And so I think that we have to examine that and say, out of fear, should we be able to say, be able to create public policy out of our prejudices, right? So prejudice is a dangerous thing, but even more dangerous when it gets embedded in public policy. And during World War II, that's what happened, is there was fear and prejudice against Japanese Americans that got turned into Executive Order 9066 and Public Law 503 and Korematsu versus United States, and became embedded as principles of law. And so the book explores that early history. It explores the anti-miscegenation statutes, laws about how Asian Americans couldn't serve as witnesses. It talks about the Japanese American incarceration, the Supreme Court cases of Hirabayashi, Yasui, and Korematsu, and then takes us all the way up to a fairly deep examination of Trump versus Hawaii, where the Supreme Court upheld the Muslim travel ban. Interesting about that case, as many people know, Justice Sotomayor in dissent said basically her concern that the Muslim travel ban was just like Korematsu versus United States, that it was basically saying that, that a certain ethnic or religious group was a danger to our country, and public policy was created out of that fear. The majority opinion said, well, we will uphold the travel ban. The court has no role when it comes to issues of national security. We have to defer to the president. We have to defer to Congress on issues of national security. We don't have a role. The Supreme Court in Korematsu case said the same thing. When it comes to issues of national security, the courts have no role, which creates a really, really dangerous precedent that basically when the government says, oh, this is for national security, the courts will step aside. We have a three-part system of government. Everybody learned it when they were in elementary school, a system of checks and balances. And if the courts step aside, then basically we have unchecked, unbridled executive and legislative power. And the courts need to play their proper role to act as a check on executive power. Otherwise, we're fraught. It's a situation fraught with danger for minorities and for civil liberties.
Let me combine two audience questions. One you just touched upon, which is the Supreme Court now. And the second one has to do with a larger population. So here are the two questions. How would the court rule on either of the Korematsu cases today? Question from the audience two is, do you see remnants of that furor over immigrants now?
So I was just talking about Trump versus Hawaii. Justice Sotomayor said this case is just like Korematsu. Justice Roberts for the majority said, no, this case is not like Korematsu. It's about the president's ability to protect our national security. The president's order is neutral on its face. It says nothing about Muslims. And then the court said, quite controversially, however, while Justice Sotomayor brings up Korematsu, we can take this opportunity to say that that case was wrongly decided. So the Supreme Court said in that opinion that Korematsu was wrong the day that it was decided. Now, some people might think the Japanese American community would celebrate that, but it couldn't, because in the same breath, the Supreme Court condemned Korematsu. It upheld a Muslim travel ban using the exact same reasoning that the court used in Korematsu, which is basically the courts have no role when it comes to issues of national security. And so the court during World War II upheld the incarceration, saying it had no role. The court in Trump v. Hawaii upheld the travel ban, saying it had no role. In addition, the court in Trump v. Hawaii said, well, look, the order is neutral on its face. It says nothing about Muslims. During World War II, Executive Order 9066 that put Japanese Americans away also said nothing on its face about Japanese Americans, but everybody knew that that's what it was about. So as far as the question is how the court would rule on Korematsu, the question is, what did the court overrule? it didn't overrule the fundamental question about whether the courts have any role when the government tries to do something on the basis of religion. Or so some people would say that. So maybe the court only overruled the point that we will not intern 120,000 Japanese Americans after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? That it's really like they won't do that again. But so maybe not 120,000 people, maybe 10 people. Maybe we'll deprive them of due process, right? So I think Korematsu is still very much alive. In fact, I think Trump v. Hawaii absolutely affirmed Korematsu. And so the next case that comes up with national security issues, I'm deeply concerned that the court's going to say, when it comes to issues of national security, the courts step aside. And it doesn't, we have to let the executive decide the right thing to do. I will add, so do you see remnants of that furor over immigrants now? Yes. We are allowing some incredible inhumanity today in the name of national security. We are separating families. We are separating children from their families. We are doing horrible things. And I know I'm talking about inhumanity versus law, but I'd like us not to think about it that way, right? Like, is it legal to do what we're doing? I think everyone would agree, or a lot of people would agree it's inhuman. But I am concerned that immigration policy is enforced along racial and ethnic lines. I am concerned about public policy decisions being made in ways that harm vulnerable communities. So Fred Korematsu's case has come up in numerous contexts. So for example, there was an article after Fred's case called AIDS in Mr. Korematsu, where someone warned about turning on the LGBTQ community during a time of AIDS, when turning on a vulnerable community in the name of perceived safety. And you recall this time, right, where people were talking about rounding up people who were HIV positive, putting them into camps. I say this because, again, this idea of fear informing public policy. And we have to be really careful about that. After 9/11, fear informing calls to round up Muslims and people who look like they're from Middle Eastern countries. And so Fred Korematsu's case has come up over and over again in the name of saying, let's be really, really careful about compromising our national ideals and having them infected by prejudice and fear.
Yeah, we need a second conversation because we're running out of time, and I have to ask this last question that APAICS always has for the speaker, and that is, what does it mean to be a resilient leader? And as part of that, maybe you could just briefly also talk about suggestions for young attorneys who are contemplating their career paths and want to be in leadership positions.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So I will go back and at least add on to a little bit I was saying was, if I didn't make it clear, Asian Pacific Americans have a stake, have a place at within the national conversation on race. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we've been so involved in talking about Asian American history, to kind of share with our own community, certainly that we are part of this conversation. And I would certainly encourage people in the audience, no matter where they work, whether in government or in business or in whatever, to see yourself as part of the conversation because it's our history, and because we see that we're now we get attacked as well. What does it mean to be a resilient leader? When I thought about this, I thought really what was most important to me is integrity. I say this, it's something I strive for. It's something that I think takes work. So I'm not saying it's easy or that I live it as well as I'd like to, but I think that one has to have one's own moral compass about what are you about? What do you believe in? What's the world you want to see? And that you use that to make decisions for your own life, for people you work for the way you treat people. And sometimes maybe that'll be unpopular or whatever, but I think you have to have that inner core. Otherwise, you'll just get battered around by the winds around you. I admire people so much who have that kind of integrity, even if I might disagree with them. I think having some type of personal code is really, really important. For people out there who want to pursue this work, advance in your careers, I think the most important thing is really find those mentors. People are so generous with their time, incredibly so, and really just say yes when opportunities are posed to you. When we were given the opportunity to work on Fred Korematsu's case, we were young, and we said yes, and it's led to a whole career. And I'm not trying to say that that's in any self-congratulatory sense, but I think that we said yes because we knew it was an important thing to do. My mother was really, really worried it would ruin the rest of my career. But you still have to really look at the opportunities in front of you and decide what the right thing is to do. So
Good advice. Good advice. Anthony, back to you.
Thank you so much, Carol and Lori. After every conversation we have, there's never enough time. We could spend the whole day and just leave this webinar open for the rest of the day and have people ask us questions. But of course, we all live busy lives. So I just really wanted to extend my thanks, especially on behalf of APAICS, for having both of you on today. Our next APAICS in Conversation is November 10th, featuring the Honorable Jenny Yang. That'll be at 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. So if you want to register for that conversation, head to apaics.org and RSVP today. Again, thank you so much.
thank
All right,
you.
vote.
Yes,
Vote.
is coming up.
Aye.